This is our other daughter. She cleans houses for a living. My mother, Patricia, smiled viciously across the candlelit table at the groom's family, holding her wineglass like a weapon. My father, Richard, leaned back in his chair, letting out a harsh laugh. We have completely given up on her at this point. I sat there in my simple black dress, staring at my hands, letting them enjoy their cruel little joke. But then the groom's mother, Josephine Davenport, froze. The elegant African-American business tycoon dropped her sterling silver fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate, echoing through the private dining room of the Michelin star restaurant. She locked her sharp eyes with me, completely ignoring my parents and their tasteless banter. "Wait, you are?" Josephine whispered, her voice shaking slightly. The entire table fell dead silent. My mother lost all color in her face, her smug smile melting into instant confusion. I am Naomi, 33 years old, and until that exact moment, I had successfully hidden a massive corporate empire from my toxic family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever let your silent success be the ultimate revenge against people who treated you like garbage. Trust me, you will want to stick around to hear how I systematically burned their delusions to the ground. To understand the sheer panic in my mother's eyes, you have to understand the absolute nightmare that was this engagement dinner. My younger sister Stella was marrying Trey Davenport. Trey was handsome, kind, and hopelessly blind to my sister's true nature. He also came from old money. The Davenport family represented the absolute pinnacle of African-American elite society. They possessed generations of vast wealth, top-tier education, and quiet, untouchable power. Josephine Davenport was a recognized force of nature who commanded international boardrooms and exclusive philanthropy galas with the exact same effortless grace. She sat across from me wearing a tailored emerald suit that whispered subtle luxury. Meanwhile, my mother wore a flashy, overly tight designer knockoff covered in unnecessary sequins, desperately trying to look wealthy. The private dining room at Le Bernardin in New York City was suffocating. The air smelled of roasted duck and the heavy, desperate perfume my mother had doused herself in before leaving the house. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow, but I felt nothing but ice-cold tension. My parents had spent the first hour of the dinner bending over backward to impress Josephine and Trey. They talked loudly about real estate investments they did not actually own, and country club memberships they could not really afford. Stella sat next to Trey, playing the role of the perfect demure bride-to-be. She batted her eyelashes and told fabricated stories about her volunteer work at animal shelters. I knew for a fact that Stella hated animals and was currently drowning in credit card debt, but I kept my mouth shut and focused on my sparkling water. I was used to playing the invisible background character. My parents had always favored Stella. She was the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was the workaholic disappointment who refused to conform to their shallow expectations. When I arrived at the restaurant tonight, I deliberately wore an understated dress and minimal makeup. I wanted to fade into the background. I had built a massive life for myself, far away from their toxic judgment, and I preferred to keep my two worlds entirely separate. But my mother could never resist an opportunity to use me as a stepping stone to elevate Stella. The moment the waiter poured the second round of expensive champagne, Patricia decided it was time to establish the family hierarchy for the Davenports. She wanted to make sure Josephine knew that Stella was the prized jewel of our family, while I was just the unfortunate, embarrassing burden they graciously tolerated. She pointed at me with her freshly manicured finger and delivered that humiliating line about me cleaning houses. She expected Josephine to nod sympathetically. She expected Trey to look at me with pity. She expected to solidify her own status by stepping directly on my dignity. She never could have anticipated that the woman sitting across from her knew exactly who I really was. What Patricia called cleaning houses was actually my corporate empire. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Elite Management. My company provides premium estate management and high-level staffing for the ultra-wealthy across the entire country. We manage multi-million-dollar properties, coordinate elite security, and provide private chefs and estate managers for the top 1%. And as fate would have it, The Davenport family portfolio was one of my company's largest and most lucrative client accounts. Josephine and I had never met in person before tonight, but we had exchanged countless emails and video calls over the past 4 years. She knew my face. She knew my voice. She knew the immense power and wealth I commanded behind closed doors. Seeing me sitting there taking verbal abuse from these ridiculous people broke her brain for a split second. The silence in the dining room stretched out, becoming heavy and incredibly uncomfortable. Trey looked between his mother and me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Stella shifted in her seat, her fake smile faltering, as she realized the spotlight had suddenly shifted away from her. Patricia cleared her throat, trying to fill the void with a nervous, awkward laugh. "Is something wrong, Josephine?" my mother asked, her voice pitching higher than normal. Josephine did not answer her. She did not even blink. She just kept staring at me, processing the wild contradiction between the pathetic narrative my parents were spinning and the absolute titan of industry she knew me to be. This was the moment my life truly changed forever. To fully grasp the magnitude of that silence, you need to rewind exactly 2 hours. My phone had buzzed at 4 in the afternoon with a frantic text message from my mother, demanding I arrive at the restaurant early. She claimed they desperately needed my help setting up the table arrangements and coordinating with the restaurant staff before the Davenport family arrived. I left my office, canceled my late afternoon meetings, and rushed across town to assist them. When I walked into the private dining room at Le Bernardin, there were no centerpieces to arrange. The restaurant staff had already set the table with absolute perfection. Crystal glasses gleamed under the soft lighting, and folded linen napkins sat precisely in the center of every plate. My parents were sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table, sipping sparkling water and looking incredibly smug. Stella was nowhere to be seen. "Sit down, Naomi," my father ordered, pointing to the chair. I took a seat and asked what they needed my help with since the room was ready. My mother did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a leather bill folder, and slid it forcefully across the smooth tablecloth until it stopped right in front of me. I opened the folder. Inside was an invoice for the engagement dinner deposit. The total was exactly $8,000. I looked up at them, genuinely confused by what was happening. I asked them why they were showing me the restaurant bill. My mother leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You are going to pay for this," she stated. Her tone was not a request, it was a command. I stared at her, wondering if she had lost her mind. I told them I was absolutely not paying $8,000 for a dinner I was barely even invited to attend. My mother let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. "Do not be selfish, Naomi," she snapped. "You are 33 years old. You have no husband. You have no children. You live in some tiny, rundown apartment. What else are you possibly spending your money on? You scrub toilets for a living, so we know you do not have any real expenses. You should be contributing to your sister's beautiful future instead of hoarding your little cleaning wages." I pushed the leather folder back across the table. I told them my finances were none of their business, and that Stella and Trey could pay for their own engagement dinner. My father slammed his fist down on the mahogany table, causing the crystal glasses to rattle. His face turned a dark shade of crimson. "You will pay this bill right now," he growled, leaning over the table to glare at me. "Or I swear to you I will completely destroy your pathetic little housekeeping business." I asked him exactly how he planned to do that. He smiled, a nasty, vindictive smile. "I will go online tonight," he threatened. "I will create dozens of fake accounts. I will post reviews on Yelp, Google, and every local community board in the city. I will say that you stole jewelry from my house. I will write that you broke expensive antiques and refused to pay for them. I will tell everyone that you are a thief and a terrible cleaner. We will absolutely ruin your reputation before the sun comes up tomorrow. You will never scrub another floor in this city again." The sheer malice in his voice was staggering. They were my own parents. They were willing to destroy what they believed was my sole source of income just to fund my sister's extravagant lifestyle. They truly thought I was a struggling maid, living paycheck to paycheck, and they were weaponizing my perceived poverty against me. I looked at my mother, expecting her to intervene or tell my father he was going too far. Instead, she simply took a sip of her water and nodded in agreement. "Pay the bill, Naomi," she said calmly, "or your father will do exactly what he promised. We are not playing games today." I sat there in the quiet dining room, absorbing the absolute reality of who my parents really were. They were extortionists. They were bullies. They were willing to crush their own daughter to impress the wealthy Davenport family. In that very moment, I could have easily destroyed them. I could have pulled up my corporate portfolio and showed them the multi-million-dollar balance in my primary checking account. I could have revealed that the tiny apartment they mocked was just a decoy property I used to keep them away from my actual penthouse. I could have told them I was the chief executive officer of a company that generated more revenue in a month than they would see in their entire lifetimes. But as I stared at their greedy, expectant faces, a different plan began to form in my mind. A much better plan. A much colder plan. If I revealed the truth right now, they would simply backtrack, apologize, and immediately start demanding I pay for the entire wedding. I wanted them to fall from the highest possible pedestal. I wanted them to feel the exact same humiliation they were constantly trying to inflict on me. I wanted to watch their entire fake reality shatter into a million pieces, so I kept my mouth shut. I reached into my purse and pulled out a plain standard issue debit card. I handed it to the waiter who had just entered the room, making sure to keep my expression completely defeated. I authorized the $8,000 charge, silently acting like I was handing over my entire life savings. My mother smirked in triumph. My father leaned back, looking incredibly satisfied. They thought they had successfully dominated their weak, poor daughter. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their lives to the ground. 30 minutes later, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open. Stella walked in first, clinging desperately to the arm of her fiancé, Trey Davenport. Trey was 30 years old and exuded the kind of effortless warmth that made people instantly like him. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet wealth without screaming for attention. Right behind them walked Josephine Davenport. The air in the room seemed to shift the moment she crossed the threshold. She was a masterclass in understated power, wearing a camel-colored cashmere wrap and a single strand of flawless South Sea pearls. Beside her, my mother in her sequined dress looked like a cheap disco ball. My father aggressively adjusted his oversized knockoff watch, trying to project authority. The contrast between the two families was physically jarring. The Davenports represented generations of African-American elite society, comfortable in their own skin and secure in their legacy. My parents represented desperate climbing, grasping at status symbols they could not afford. Trey immediately broke the tension with a bright, genuine smile. He stepped forward to shake my father's hand and kiss my mother's cheek, thanking them profusely for organizing the dinner. You could see the goodness in him. He was a genuinely kind man who believed the best in people. Unfortunately, that same kindness made him the perfect mark for my sister. He looked at Stella with absolute adoration, completely blinded by the flawless, innocent facade she had constructed for him. Trey pulled out a chair for his mother before taking his own seat next to Stella. I remained seated at the far end of the table, observing the dynamic unfold. Trey finally noticed me and offered a polite nod, assuming I was just a quiet relative, or perhaps a friend they had brought along. My parents made absolutely no effort to introduce me. I was a ghost in my own family. Josephine, on the other hand, missed nothing. Her sharp, intelligent eyes swept across the room, taking in the floral arrangements, the crystal, and the strained posture of my parents. She evaluated my father's desperate attempts at making small talk about golf courses he had never actually played on. She noticed my mother nervously smoothing down her tacky dress. Then her gaze landed on me. I kept my face perfectly blank, offering a small, respectful nod. Josephine tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture of curiosity, before turning her attention back to her son. She was a woman who navigated corporate boardrooms and devoured weak executives for breakfast. She could smell the desperation rolling off my parents from a mile away. But she remained impeccably polite, sipping her sparkling water and offering measured, graceful responses to their frantic babbling. Once the first course arrived, Stella launched into her performance. She had clearly rehearsed her talking points. She leaned against Trey and began spinning an elaborate web of absolute fiction. She talked about her exhausting week coordinating a charity gala for underprivileged children. She sighed heavily, claiming the philanthropic board relied on her entirely too much. I focused on cutting my asparagus so I would not accidentally laugh out loud. Stella had never volunteered a single day in her entire life. Her only hobby was maxing out credit cards on designer shoes and crying to our parents when the collection agencies called. Yet Trey gazed at her with pure awe, squeezing her hand and telling his mother how incredibly selfless Stella was. My mother chimed in, immediately inflating the lie by declaring that generosity was simply a core trait of our family. The lies only escalated as the wine was poured. Stella seamlessly transitioned from fake charity work to imaginary luxury vacations. She passionately described summers spent sailing off the coast of the French Riviera and winter skiing trips in the Swiss Alps. She painted a picture of a childhood steeped in high-end culture and endless privilege. She gestured toward my father, praising his brilliant real estate portfolio and claiming he had taught her everything she knew about managing wealth. In reality, my father managed a mid-level regional sales team and took out a second mortgage just to pay off Stella's car loan last year. They were building a massive house of cards right in front of the Davenports. Every word out of Stella's mouth was designed to prove she was equal to their social standing. Throughout this entire theatrical display, my family acted as though I was completely invisible. Stella did not acknowledge my presence even once. When the waiter brought the main courses, she casually rearranged her silverware and continued her monologue about the grueling demands of high society life. My parents hung on her every word, nodding enthusiastically and adding their own fabricated details whenever she paused for breath. They were so consumed by their own performance that they failed to notice Josephine Davenport growing increasingly quiet. Josephine was not eating much. She was watching Stella with the terrifying precision of a predator observing a very loud, very clueless prey. Josephine asked polite, probing questions that forced Stella to elaborate on her lies, causing my sister to stumble slightly over geographical details of the French Riviera. I sat silently at the end of the table, absorbing every single ridiculous claim. I watched my sister weave a beautiful fragile trap for herself. She was so intoxicated by the idea of marrying into the Davenport empire that she had lost all touch with reality. The tension in the air was thickening rapidly. My parents were pushing their luck. Stella was pushing her luck. And Josephine Davenport was quietly calculating exactly how to handle them. I knew from my extensive corporate experience that Josephine did not tolerate fools gladly. She built her legacy by exposing frauds and ruining liars. I took another slow sip of sparkling water, hiding a small, knowing smile behind the rim of my crystal glass. The real disaster was just about to begin now. Section 4, exactly 1,000 words. The waiter approached our table carrying a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that likely cost more than my parents' mortgage payment. He moved gracefully around the table, filling the crystal glasses of Trey, Josephine, Stella, and my parents. As the waiter stepped toward my end of the table, my mother suddenly cleared her throat. "Oh, please do not waste the good vintage on her," my mother instructed, waving her hand dismissively at the waiter. "Just bring her the cheapest house red you have." Trey shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his polite smile faltering. He opened his mouth to object, but my father quickly jumped in to support the humiliation. "Patricia is right," my father chuckled loudly. "There is no point in pouring liquid gold for someone who prefers tap water." The waiter hesitated, looking incredibly awkward before giving a tight professional nod and walking away to fetch my budget beverage. Josephine Davenport did not say a single word. She simply watched my mother with a gaze so sharp it could cut glass. But Patricia was not finished asserting her absolute dominance over me. A few minutes later, when the appetizers were cleared from the table, my mother snapped her fingers fiercely in my direction. "Naomi, go find the maitre d' and fetch us some fresh linen napkins," she commanded, pointing toward the kitchen doors. "We spilled a little water over here, and you are the fastest on your feet. Be useful for once in your life." I sat perfectly still for a second, letting the sheer audacity of her request sink into my brain. We were sitting in an exclusive restaurant surrounded by highly trained waitstaff whose entire job was to cater to our exact needs. Yet my own mother was ordering me to jump up and act like a personal servant in front of the groom and his billionaire mother. Trey looked visibly distressed by this display. "Mrs. Patricia, I can just signal the waiter," he offered kindly, half rising from his chair to flag someone down. "Nonsense," my mother insisted, placing a firm hand on Trey's arm to stop him. "Naomi does not mind doing the heavy lifting. She is used to fetching and carrying things for other people. It is basically what she does all day anyway." She turned her icy glare back to me. "Do not keep our very important guests waiting." I calmly placed my napkin on the table, stood up smoothing the skirt of my dress, and walked out of the private room. I did not do it because I was feeling submissive. I did it because I wanted to give Josephine Davenport a few more minutes to carefully analyze the grotesque dynamic unfolding right in front of her eyes. When I returned a few moments later with the requested linens, I handed them directly to the waiter who had rushed over, apologizing profusely for the inconvenience. I quietly returned to my seat at the far end of the long table. She leaned across the table toward Josephine, ready to deliver what she believed would be the ultimate punchline to her cruel joke. She gestured toward me with her wine glass. "You see, Josephine, this is our other daughter, Naomi. She cleans houses for a living." My father leaned back in his leather chair, letting out a harsh, booming laugh that filled the room. "We have completely given up on her at this point," he added, shaking his head in mock pity. "We tried to push her toward a real career, but some people are just destined to scrub other people's floors." The air in the room instantly solidified into ice. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to completely vanish into thin air. Josephine Davenport froze mid-motion. The sterling silver fork she was holding slipped right from her fingers. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate, echoing like a gunshot through the private dining room. She locked her piercing dark eyes directly onto me. "Wait," Josephine whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "You are." She stopped speaking, but the silence that followed her unfinished sentence was deafening. My mother lost all the color in her face, her smug smile melting into instant confusion. Patricia looked around the table, desperate to understand why the billionaire matriarch had suddenly turned entirely pale. What my parents did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend, was the explosive truth hiding behind my calm exterior. My company, Apex Elite Management, did not just clean houses. We managed the entire Davenport family empire. My corporation staffed Josephine's sprawling estate in the Hamptons. We managed the strict security protocols for her Manhattan penthouse. We vetted, hired, and deployed the private chefs, drivers, and estate managers who kept her multi-million-dollar lifestyle running flawlessly. I was the chief executive officer who personally signed off on the Davenport accounts. Josephine and I had spent hours on encrypted video calls, negotiating high-level security contracts, and discussing the discreet management of her global properties. I had purposefully kept my camera off during our initial audio meetings, but over the last year, we had conducted several face-to-face digital conferences. She knew I commanded an absolute army of elite staff and possessed a net worth that completely dwarfed her own son's trust fund. Sitting across from each other in that stuffy private dining room, Josephine and I shared a brief and very intensely communicative look. In that single millisecond of locked eye contact, entire volumes of information were exchanged without a single word being spoken aloud. She saw the cheap and humiliating treatment my parents inflicted on me. I saw her sudden horrifying realization that she was breaking bread with people who actively abused the most powerful vendor in her entire corporate network. Josephine quickly realized that the flawless, innocent facade Stella had carefully built was a total fabrication. If Stella and my parents were lying this brazenly about my identity, what else were they all truly lying to her about today? Josephine Davenport broke our locked gaze with the precision of a seasoned chess player sensing a trap. She understood immediately that exposing my true identity right then and there would only cause a chaotic public spectacle. She needed time to investigate this bizarre situation on her own terms, and she was not about to give my parents the satisfaction of another second of her time. Josephine suddenly pressed a manicured hand against her temple, letting out a sharp intake of breath. She closed her eyes tightly and swayed slightly in her chair, performing the sudden onset of a severe medical issue with absolute flawless execution. Trey instantly dropped his napkin and rushed to his mother's side, his face etched with genuine panic. "Mom, what is wrong?" he asked, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Josephine let out a shaky sigh, keeping her eyes closed. "I'm so sorry, Trey," she whispered, her voice sounding incredibly strained. "I am experiencing a sudden and overwhelmingly severe dizzy spell. The room is completely spinning. I need to leave this restaurant immediately before I faint." My parents launched into immediate frantic action. My mother practically vaulted out of her chair, her cheap sequins flashing under the chandeliers. "Oh my goodness," Josephine, Patricia shrieked, waving her hands uselessly. "Let me get you some water. Let me call a doctor. We can have the chef bring you something sweet to raise your blood sugar. Please do not leave the dinner just started." Josephine held up a single silencing hand. The gesture was so commanding that my mother instantly froze in her tracks. "No thank you, Patricia." Josephine said, her tone polite, but laced with absolute undeniable finality. "I suffer from severe migraines, and the only remedy is immediate rest in a dark, quiet room. Trey, please help me to the car. We must depart right now." Trey gently helped his mother to her feet, completely ignoring Stella's desperate attempts to grab his arm. "I am so sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Adams." Trey apologized hurriedly, supporting Josephine's weight as they moved toward the door. "Stella, I will call you the second I get her home and settled. I promise we will make this up to you. Do not worry about us." Trey. Stella forced a high-pitched, sickeningly sweet fake laugh. "Just take care of your mother. Send her my absolute best wishes for a speedy recovery." Josephine paused at the mahogany doors. She turned her head slightly, glancing back toward the table. Her eyes bypassed my parents entirely and landed squarely on me for one final second. It was a silent promise. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving the four of us alone in the stifling private dining room. For 10 agonizing seconds after the Davenports exited, the room remained perfectly still. The only sound was the faint clinking of silverware from the main dining area outside. Then the illusion shattered completely. Stella let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed her heavy crystal water goblet and hurled it violently against the far wall. The glass shattered into 100 sparkling pieces, raining down on the plush carpet. "You ruined everything!" Stella shrieked, her face contorting into an ugly, vicious snarl. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You and your disgusting peasant vibes completely ruined my engagement dinner." She was disgusted by you. She took one look at your pathetic cheap dress and your miserable face, and she literally had to fake an illness just to escape the stench of your poverty. I sat back in my chair, watching my sister throw a temper tantrum fit for a spoiled toddler. I did not say a word. I did not need to. Her mask had slipped completely, exposing the greedy, toxic monster hiding underneath the bridal glow. "You were supposed to sit there and be quiet," Stella continued, her chest heaving with exertion. "You were supposed to be the ugly background prop that made me look even better by comparison. But your miserable aura drove my future mother-in-law out of the room. Do you have any idea how much money I just lost out on tonight because of you?" My parents quickly joined the assault, treating my silence as an invitation to tear me apart. My father slammed both of his hands down onto the dining table, knocking over the expensive bottle of wine he had ordered for himself. A dark red stain began spreading rapidly across the pristine white linen, but he did not care. He leaned over the table, his veins popping in his neck. "Your sister is right," Richard spat, glaring at me with absolute disgust. "Josephine Davenport is a woman of high society. She is used to rubbing elbows with millionaires and politicians. When your mother generously introduced you, Josephine was clearly horrified to realize our family has a daughter who scrubs toilets for minimum wage. You embarrassed us, Naomi. You embarrassed this entire family." My mother marched down the length of the table, her face flushed with fury. She stood looming over me, pointing a sharp finger mere inches from my nose. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little brat," Patricia hissed. "You are never going to speak to Trey's family again. You are never going to look at them. You are never going to breathe the same air as them. If you ever see Josephine Davenport or Trey walking down the street, you will turn around and walk the other way." I stared up at my mother, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. I let the harsh insults wash over me like water off a rock. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the massive trap closing around them. "You are going to stay away from the Davenports," Patricia demanded loudly. "You are going to stay in your lane. Do you understand me, Naomi?" I gave a slow, deliberate nod, remaining perfectly quiet now. 3 days later, the relentless pounding on my front door shattered the quiet peace of my Sunday morning. I walked across the scuffed linoleum floor of my tiny studio apartment and unlocked the heavy metal deadbolt. Before I could even turn the brass handle, my father pushed his way inside, forcing the door wide open. My mother and Stella marched in right behind him, completely uninvited and entirely unapologetic. They looked around my cramped living space with expressions of absolute undisguised disgust. I crossed my arms and watched them carefully evaluate the peeling white paint on the ceiling and the cheap secondhand sofa pushed against the far wall. They had absolutely no idea that this miserable little studio was nothing more than a carefully maintained decoy. I kept this cheap rental under a fake corporate alias, specifically to blindside my greedy family. It was the perfect stage set to convince them I was struggling to survive on minimum wage. My actual residence was a multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking the city skyline, but keeping them away from my real life was worth paying the monthly rent on this miserable shoebox. My mother immediately pulled a scented lace handkerchief from her designer purse and pressed it against her nose as if the very air inside my apartment was toxic and suffocating. Stella refused to even step fully onto the faded rug, hovering near the narrow entryway, while meticulously inspecting her freshly manicured nails. I asked them what they wanted, since barging into my home unannounced was crossing a massive line even for their terrible standards. Stella dropped her hand and looked at me with a triumphant, wicked smile illuminating her face. "We secured the ultimate venue," she announced, her voice dripping with sheer, arrogant pride. "I finally locked down the absolute perfect location for the wedding weekend. We booked the grand estate." I kept my facial expression perfectly neutral, but inside my mind was racing with absolute shock and pure dark amusement. The grand estate was an ultra-exclusive, sprawling luxury compound located on the most expensive stretch of coastline in the entire state. It was an elite architectural masterpiece, featuring private, pristine beaches, heavily fortified security gates, and luxury amenities, designed exclusively for billionaires and foreign royalty. It was also completely, totally, and legally owned by my corporation, Apex Elite Management. The estate was my flagship property and my personal crown jewel. Stella paced around my tiny kitchen, waving her hands dramatically as she bragged endlessly about her magnificent accomplishment. She claimed she had to pull massive social strings and heavily leverage Trey's powerful family name just to get the booking agent on the phone. She bragged about the heated infinity pools, the massive crystal ballrooms, and the sweeping master suites. She told me the Davenports were going to be completely blown away by the sheer magnitude of the property. My father puffed out his chest, standing right next to my leaky kitchen sink. He proudly declared that hosting the wedding at the grand estate would instantly cement our family into the upper echelons of high society forever. I calmly asked them why they felt the sudden need to break into my apartment just to brag about a wedding venue I was not even formally invited to attend. My mother's fake smile instantly vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating glare. She took a heavy step toward me, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "There is a small complication," Patricia stated, her tone entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. "The rental fee for the estate was absolutely astronomical. Stella completely blew through her entire wedding budget just to secure the location for the 3-day weekend. We had to make some extremely heavy financial sacrifices to make this happen." I stared at her blankly and asked what her financial sacrifices had to do with me. Stella stepped forward, pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at my chest. "The estate requires a mandatory elite staffing package for any large events," she complained bitterly, throwing her hands up in frustration. "But we do not have a single dollar left in the budget to pay for the private chefs, the security detail, or the premium cleaning crew. So you are going to pack your bags right now." My mother nodded firmly, backing up my sister's absolutely outrageous command. You are going to act as the live-in maid for the entire 3-day weekend, Patricia ordered, her voice echoing off the thin walls. You will scrub the marble floors, you will clean the guest bathrooms, and you will pick up the trash after the reception ends. You will stay entirely out of sight, and you will do it completely free of charge. You owe this massive favor to your sister after embarrassing us so thoroughly in front of Josephine Davenport at the engagement dinner. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer audacity of their ridiculous demand wash entirely over me. They were standing aggressively inside my decoy apartment, barking cruel orders at a woman who could easily buy and sell their entire existence with a single phone call. My father stepped closer, towering over me in the cramped kitchen space to forcefully assert his dominance. You are going to work around the clock, Richard demanded, his voice incredibly low and threatening. You will sleep in the servant quarters, and you will not speak to a single guest during the entire event. If you refuse to do this, we will absolutely make sure your life becomes a miserable living nightmare. The irony of the situation was almost too delicious to handle. They were ordering the legitimate owner of the grand estate to work as an unpaid janitor inside her own fiercely protected fortress. I looked at my sister Stella, who was smiling with pure venomous joy. I looked at my mother, who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable servant. I looked at my father, who was actively threatening me. I simply nodded. Then I took a deep breath, dropped my arms, and told them absolutely not. I refused to spend my weekend scrubbing toilets for a sister who treated me like garbage. I told them they needed to leave my apartment immediately before I called the police for trespassing. Stella gasped, dramatically clutching her chest, as if my refusal physically wounded her. My mother shrieked, calling me a selfish, ungrateful monster who was actively trying to destroy the most important day of my sister's entire life. But my father did not yell. He did not scream. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, pulling out a small, faded velvet box. He held it up, letting the dim light of my cheap apartment kitchen catch the worn fabric. My heart stopped dead in my chest. The air left my lungs in one sharp exhale. I recognized that box instantly. It belonged to my late grandmother, the only person in our entire family who had ever shown me an ounce of genuine, unconditional love. Before she passed away, she promised me her antique sapphire and diamond brooch. It was a stunning heirloom passed down through 4 generations, and it was the only physical connection I had left to her memory. When she died, my parents swooped in and took total control of her estate, locking all her valuables away and completely refusing to hand over the brooch. They claimed they were keeping it safe for me until I was older, but I knew they were just holding it hostage to use as leverage whenever they needed to control my behavior. My father popped the velvet box open, revealing the brilliant blue sapphire resting on a bed of yellowed satin. It sparkled beautifully, mocking me from his cruel hands. You see, Naomi, my father said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm and steady rhythm. I knew you would try to be difficult today. I knew you would selfishly refuse to help your own family in our time of desperate financial need. So I brought a little extra motivation to help you see reason. He snapped the box shut with a sharp click. He stepped closer, forcing me to back up against the edge of the kitchen counter. If you do not pack your bags right now and serve your sister at the grand estate, he threatened, I will take this box out to the garage tonight. I will place this precious heirloom on the concrete floor and take a heavy steel hammer to it. I will smash these diamonds into dust. I will crush this sapphire until it is nothing more than blue powder. And if I get tired of smashing it, I will drive down to the river and throw whatever is left into the deepest, darkest water I can find. You will never see it again. The sheer cruelty of his threat was staggering. How was weaponizing the memory of a dead woman just to force me into free manual labor? Stella smirked, leaning against the doorframe, looking incredibly satisfied with our father's ruthless blackmail. My mother crossed her arms, nodding approvingly at the brutal ultimatum. They were fully prepared to destroy a priceless, irreplaceable family heirloom just to maintain their fake facade of wealth in front of the Davenport family. I looked at the velvet box gripped tightly in my father's massive hand. The urge to rip it away from him was almost overwhelming, but I knew a physical fight would achieve nothing. He was stronger, and they outnumbered me 3-1. If I fought back, he would destroy the brooch out of pure spite. I needed a different approach. I needed to play their sick, twisted game until I held all the winning cards. I lowered my head, forcing my shoulders to slump in an exaggerated display of total defeat. I let out a shaky, heavy sigh, acting as though they had completely broken my spirit. "Fine," I whispered, keeping my voice small and incredibly submissive. "I will do it. I will pack my bags and I will clean the estate. Just please do not hurt the brooch, I beg you." My father smiled a nasty, victorious grin and slipped the velvet box back into his jacket pocket. "Good girl," he mocked, patting my cheek with a heavy, condescending hand. "I knew you would finally learn to behave." My mother clapped her hands together sharply, issuing her final commands. "We will pick you up on Thursday morning," Patricia barked. "Wear something completely unremarkable. You will use the service entrance and you will remain entirely invisible to the guests." As they finally turned and marched out of my tiny decoy apartment, slamming the heavy metal door behind them, I let the mask of submission fall completely away. I walked over to my cheap closet and pulled out a battered canvas duffel bag. I began tossing a few faded t-shirts and worn-out jeans into the bag, maintaining the illusion of the poor, struggling cleaner they expected to pick up on Thursday. But as I zipped the duffel bag shut, a cold, calculating smile spread slowly across my face. They thought they held all the power. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner using a priceless family heirloom. They had absolutely no idea what they were actually walking into. The Grand Estate was not just a venue. It was the crown jewel of my corporate empire. I personally oversaw its acquisition, its renovation, and its highly advanced security infrastructure. Every single staff member working at the estate, from the groundskeepers to the private chefs, was on my direct payroll. I controlled the property entirely. My family was demanding that I work as an unpaid maid inside my own multi-million-dollar fortress. They were marching blindly into the absolute center of my power. I would let them hold on to their arrogant delusions for just a little while longer because the trap was set. Before the heavy metal door could even click shut behind my parents, Stella suddenly pushed her way back inside my tiny apartment. She was lugging a massive, oversized canvas tote bag over her shoulder. She marched directly past me, completely ignoring my presence, and slammed the heavy bag down onto my cheap kitchen table. She reached into the canvas bag and began forcefully yanking out a disorganized pile of thick, heavy wedding planning binders. She dumped them haphazardly across the small table, sending loose papers, color swatches, and fabric samples spilling onto the scuffed floor. "You did not actually think you were just going to pack your bags and sit around doing nothing until Thursday, did you?" Stella sneered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Since you are going to be my personal maid for the entire weekend, you need to memorize every detail of the event. I need you to completely organize these vendor schedules by tomorrow morning. The caterers, the florists, the security teams, and the valet services are completely mixed up. I am far too busy and important to deal with this administrative garbage. Sort it out, color code the delivery times, and make sure nothing overlaps. If a single flower arrangement arrives late, I will personally make sure Dad shatters that antique brooch into a million tiny pieces." Without waiting for a response, she spun around and marched out of my apartment. This time the door slammed shut, leaving me standing in absolute silence. I looked down at the chaotic mountain of wedding binders covering my kitchen table. It was a complete disaster. Papers were shoved randomly into the wrong folders. Sticky notes covered in frantic, illegible handwriting were attached to glossy brochures for luxury linen rentals and premium champagne distributors. My sister wanted a billionaire wedding on a non-existent budget, and she expected me to magically untangle the logistical nightmare she had created. I let out a heavy sigh and sat down. I began methodically sorting through the massive and truly overwhelming pile of scattered documents. I opened the largest binder, which was supposedly dedicated to the floral arrangements. Stella had ordered tens of thousands of dollars worth of rare imported orchids and custom-built rose arches. It was a staggering amount of money to spend on flowers alone. As I flipped past the final vendor contract, a folded piece of paper slipped out from the very back of the plastic sleeve. It fluttered quietly down and landed face up on my lap. I picked up the thick, expensive paper, expecting it to be another ridiculous invoice for imported ribbon or custom-printed napkins. But it was not an invoice. It was an official bank statement from a highly exclusive lending institution. I scanned the bold black text printed across the top of the page. My heart immediately slammed against my ribs. The air in my tiny kitchen suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. The blood running rapidly through my veins turned to absolute ice. The bank statement was not addressed to Stella. It was addressed directly to me. My full legal name, Naomi Marie Adams, was printed perfectly across the official header. Beneath my name was my current actual residential address, the luxury penthouse they knew absolutely nothing about. But the most horrifying detail was printed just below my personal information. It was my complete, highly confidential social security number. I gripped the edges of the paper so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I forced my eyes to read the financial breakdown listed in the center of the page. It was an approved personal loan document. The principal loan amount was an absolutely staggering $200,000. The funds had already been fully disbursed and transferred into a checking account that I did not recognize. A wave of pure, blinding rage washed over me. I felt physically sick. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Stella had not just blown her wedding budget. She had committed massive federal financial fraud to fund her pathetic, desperate climb into high society. She had somehow gained access to my most secure confidential information. She had stolen my social security number. She had forged my signature. She had used my impeccable credit score to secure a massive high-interest personal loan that she never intended to pay back. My sister had saddled me with a $200,000 debt just so she could impress the Davenport family with fake wealth. She had effectively stolen my financial identity to throw a 3-day party. The sheer magnitude of her betrayal was almost impossible to process. She was not just a spoiled brat demanding free labor anymore. She was a deeply calculating criminal who was actively trying to destroy my entire future. I placed the bank statement carefully back onto the kitchen table. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, but it was not from fear or panic. It was from an intense burning anger that consumed every rational thought in my brain. My parents had threatened to destroy my grandmother's brooch to force me into servitude, but my sister had already stolen my identity to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. They truly believed I was a weak, helpless target. They thought I would eventually discover this massive debt and simply collapse under the weight of it, unable to fight back. They had no idea that I commanded a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. They had no idea that I could freeze those fraudulent accounts with a single phone call. But doing that right now would be far too easy. It would not inflict the maximum amount of pain. I picked up my phone and opened a highly encrypted scanning application. I meticulously photographed every page of the bank statement, capturing the fraudulent signatures, the account numbers, and the routing details. I uploaded the files directly to a secure offshore server, ensuring the evidence was perfectly preserved and entirely untouchable. I looked at the chaotic pile of wedding binders spread across my table. Stella wanted me to organize her vendor schedules. She wanted me to ensure her spectacular wedding went off without a problem. I slowly smiled, a deeply cold and incredibly dangerous smile, to myself. I would organize her schedules perfectly. I would make sure every guest arrived on time. I would make sure her wedding was the most unforgettable event of the decade. But it would not be a celebration of her fake wealth. It would instead be the spectacular public execution of her entire miserable fake life. Section 9, exactly 1,000 words. I stared at the glowing confirmation screen on my phone until the screen went dark. The digital vault was locked. The encrypted files were now safely bouncing across offshore servers, completely untouchable by my family or anyone else. A normal person would have immediately grabbed their car keys, driven straight to the local police precinct, and filed a massive identity theft report. A normal person would have screamed, cried, and demanded immediate justice for this staggering violation. But I was not a normal person, and my family was certainly not dealing with a normal situation. If I confronted Stella right now in the middle of my cheap kitchen, she would instantly burst into dramatic theatrical tears. She would wildly claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding, or that Trey had authorized it, or worse, she would spin a lie saying I had willingly given her my information to help her out. My parents would immediately rush to her defense. They would gaslight me until I was exhausted, claiming I was just jealous of her upcoming marriage. They would try to manipulate the narrative and hide the evidence before I could strike. I needed you to understand exactly why I chose silence in that moment. Confronting a narcissist behind closed doors accomplishes absolutely nothing. They thrive in the shadows where they can twist reality and play the eternal victim. If I blew up the wedding before it even started, Stella would simply run to the Davenport family crying about her vicious, jealous older sister who ruined her special day out of pure spite. She would somehow find a way to manipulate Trey into paying off the fraudulent loan just to save her from legal trouble. She would walk away completely unscathed. I could not allow her to escape the consequences of her actions. I needed her to feel the absolute maximum amount of pain. I needed her to fall from the highest possible pedestal imaginable. I wanted her surrounded by the wealthiest elite members of society, draped in expensive imported silk and holding the hand of a billionaire heir when the crushing weight of reality finally shattered her spine. I wanted the Davenports to see exactly who she was in front of hundreds of witnesses, so that no amount of crying or gaslighting could ever save her. This required discipline and total self-control. This was no longer just about protecting my business or dealing with my toxic parents holding a family heirloom hostage. This was about survival. Stella had crossed a fatal boundary. Identity theft on this massive scale was a serious federal crime carrying heavy prison sentences. She had weaponized my pristine financial standing to fund her delusions of grandeur. I carefully folded the original bank statement and slipped it into a hidden waterproof safe beneath my floorboards. I locked the metal compartment, hearing the satisfying click of the heavy steel mechanism. Then I returned to the mountain of wedding binders, spreading them out across the table. I grabbed a set of highlighters and began methodically organizing her vendor schedules, delivery times, and catering menus. I color-coded every single detail with terrifying precision. I was going to ensure this wedding operated like a flawless military campaign. There would be no logistical errors. There would be no late flower deliveries or confused catering staff. I would personally guarantee that the stage was set perfectly for her spectacular destruction. Once the schedules were perfectly aligned, I picked up my phone again and dialed a highly secure private number. The line rang exactly twice before my lead corporate attorney answered. His name was Donovan, and he was a brilliant, ruthless legal shark who specialized in elite corporate warfare. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him to cancel all his appointments for the rest of the week because we had a massive emergency on our hands. I explained the situation in detail, outlining the stolen Social Security number, the forged signatures, and the $200,000 fraudulent loan. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line as Donovan processed the sheer audacity of my sister's crime. He immediately recognized the severity of the financial violation. I instructed him to immediately draft a comprehensive civil lawsuit and prepare an airtight criminal referral for federal identity theft. I told him to coordinate directly with our private investigators to track exactly where every single dollar of that loan had been deposited and spent. I needed an irrefutable paper trail linking Stella directly to the fraud, leaving her absolutely no room to claim she was somehow ignorant of the transaction. Every signature, every transfer, every digital footprint needed to be verified, authenticated, and locked into evidence. Donovan asked if he should contact the local authorities immediately to begin the formal criminal investigation process. I told him absolutely not. I explicitly ordered him to keep the entire investigation completely silent until I gave the final specific signal. I instructed him to draft the legal documents, print them on the finest legal parchment, and have them bound and ready for immediate delivery by our security courier. I needed the arrest warrants quietly prepared and standing by in the hands of cooperative law enforcement officials. I wanted everything locked, loaded, and hovering right above my sister's head like a razor-sharp guillotine. Donovan promised the entire legal package would be flawlessly executed within 48 hours without a single leak to the press or the public. I ended the call and placed my phone down on the table, staring at the neat stacks of wedding documents. The legal trap was now completely set. The evidence was permanently secured. My corporate attorneys were mobilizing with devastating efficiency. All I had to do now was play the part of the obedient, pathetic maid serving a spoiled bride. I packed my canvas duffel bag, zipped it shut, and waited for Thursday morning to arrive. The real game was just beginning right here now. Thursday morning broke with a heavy coastal fog that slowly burned off as my father's generic sedan pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of the grand estate. I sat in the cramped back seat clutching my cheap canvas duffel bag while my mother Patricia buzzed the intercom system. The massive gates swung open, revealing the sweeping cobblestone driveway that wound through acres of manicured gardens and ancient oak trees. The estate looked absolutely breathtaking, bathed in the early morning sunlight. I felt a surge of intense pride, knowing I owned every single blade of grass on this magnificent property. My father drove past the grand main entrance with its towering marble columns and immediately steered the car toward the hidden rear access roads. He parked roughly near the commercial loading dock used strictly for vendor deliveries and waste removal. My mother turned around in her seat and shoved a plastic bag directly into my chest. "Put this on immediately," Patricia ordered, her voice sharp and completely devoid of any warmth. "You are not walking through the halls looking like a homeless person." I opened the plastic bag and pulled out a stiff, scratchy gray maid uniform. It was at least 2 sizes too big and smelled faintly of industrial bleach. It was the exact type of humiliating attire you would see in a cheap television drama, not the sleek, custom-tailored professional uniforms my actual Apex Elite staff wore. I stared at the ugly gray fabric, feeling the coarse material rub roughly against my skin. "The service entrance is right there." My father pointed to a heavy steel door near the dumpsters. "Get inside, find the cleaning supplies, and stay out of sight. We have wealthy guests arriving by noon, and you better not embarrass us." I stepped out of the car without saying a single word. I walked through the heavy steel door and found a small utility closet to change into the ridiculous scratchy uniform. The fabric chafed against my shoulders instantly, but I welcomed the discomfort. It was a physical reminder of exactly why I was enduring this charade. I rolled my hair into a tight, messy bun, grabbed a plastic spray bottle, and walked out into the massive commercial kitchen. The sheer scale of the operation I had built was buzzing with flawless efficiency all around me. Michelin-starred chefs were prepping intricate hors d'oeuvres. Highly trained hospitality managers were coordinating seating charts with military precision. But the smooth, professional rhythm of my staff was constantly being interrupted by a shrill, piercing voice echoing from the main ballroom. I pushed through the swinging kitchen doors and kept my head down, clutching my spray bottle. I walked quietly along the edge of the grand ballroom, pretending to wipe down a pristine marble windowsill. Stella was standing in the dead center of the massive room, wearing a silk designer robe she had undoubtedly purchased using my stolen social security number. She was pacing furiously back and forth, aggressively snapping her manicured fingers at the professional event coordinators. "You people are moving too incredibly slow," Stella shrieked, pointing a sharp finger at a team of florists, arranging a massive archway of imported white roses. "I told you I wanted the roses angled toward the natural light. Do you not understand basic instructions, or are you just completely incompetent?" She spun around and marched directly toward a towering man in a sleek black suit. It was my lead security director. Stella shoved her finger directly into the security director's chest. "You," she barked, treating the highly trained former Special Forces operative like a disobedient child. I saw a stray leaf on the front walkway. "If the Davenport family steps on a single piece of debris, I will personally have you fired and blacklisted from this industry forever. Do your job and sweep the driveway." The security director stood perfectly rigid, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. His facial expression remained entirely blank, giving absolutely nothing away. My heart swelled with immense pride watching my elite staff maintain their absolute composure in the face of such grotesque behavior. They were elite professionals, trained to handle demanding billionaires and difficult foreign dignitaries. Dealing with a loud, broke fraud, like my sister, was child's play to them, but it still made my blood boil to watch her abuse my team. I continued moving slowly along the perimeter of the room, keeping my face turned toward the wall. Stella continued her rampage, marching over to a catering manager to scream about the temperature of the bottled water. She was high on the fake power she believed she held. She truly thought she was a wealthy, untouchable elite ordering around the lower working class. She had absolutely no idea that every single person in that room was earning a six-figure salary and reported directly to the quiet maid currently scrubbing the windowsill. I wiped the cloth across the marble and briefly glanced up at the security director. He had slightly shifted his position to keep Stella in his peripheral vision while conducting a visual sweep of the room. His sharp eyes scanned the perimeter and immediately locked directly onto mine. We stared at each other from across the massive crystal ballroom. I did not break eye contact. The security director recognized me instantly despite the oversized, scratchy uniform and the messy hair. He knew his chief executive officer was standing in the room holding a cheap plastic spray bottle. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. He was waiting for a command. He was ready to call in the entire security detail and forcibly remove the screaming woman from the premises if I gave the signal. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I gave him one low, subtle nod. It was an unspoken command, acknowledging his restraint and ordering him to play along with the charade. Do not engage. Let her dig it deeper right now. Understood. Section 11, exactly 1,000 words. The security director gave a nearly invisible blink of compliance and turned smoothly away. He resumed his patrol, leaving Stella to shriek at the terrified floral team. I spent the afternoon fading into the marble walls, scrubbing baseboards, while my family treated my elite staff like garbage. When midnight arrived, the estate fell into a heavy quiet. The caterers packed up their staging areas, and the demanding bride retreated to the master suite she unlawfully claimed. I waited inside my cramped servant quarters until my parents were asleep in the guest wing. I stripped off the scratchy maid uniform and threw it onto the cot. I pulled on a sleek black turtleneck and dark-tailored trousers, transforming instantly from a disposable servant into the architect of this operation. I slipped silently out of the service wing, navigating the hidden staff corridors that snaked behind the main walls. My family thought they had relegated me to the lowest tier of the property, but these secret passages were designed specifically for my executive team to move unseen. I bypassed the grand staircase and approached a solid steel door concealed behind an antique tapestry. There was no keyhole and no handle. I pressed my right thumb against a hidden biometric scanner embedded in the molding. The scanner glowed, reading my unique print and confirming my clearance level. The heavy door clicked open with a soft hiss. I stepped inside the security control room. The room was dark, except for the blue light radiating from a massive wall of high-definition surveillance monitors. Every single inch of the exterior grounds, the perimeter gates and the public spaces was actively monitored here. David, my head of security, was standing at the main command console. He turned around as the door sealed shut behind me. He did not ask why his billionaire boss was creeping around her own property in the dead of night. He simply straightened his posture and waited for my directives. I walked over to the glowing monitors and tapped the screen displaying the grand ballroom. David, I said, keeping my voice authoritative, I need you to initiate a total lockdown on the interior surveillance network. Deploy the secondary tactical camera systems immediately. We are blind in the private dining halls, the library, and the upper corridors where my parents are staying. My family is highly unpredictable and extremely greedy. They are going to cause significant damage to this property before the wedding ceremony begins, and I need footage of every single violation they commit. David nodded sharply, his fingers already flying across the encrypted keyboard. The standard estate privacy protocols require us to disable interior cameras during private events, he stated, his eyes locked on the screens. But since you are the legal owner and the primary target of an active financial fraud investigation, I can authorize an emergency override. I will dispatch the night shift tactical team right now. They will install temporary hidden cameras inside the crown molding and behind the decorative fixtures in all the main halls and gathering spaces. Nobody will ever know they are being watched. I watched the screens as David deployed the specialized team. I need absolute perfection, I told him. My father Richard has a notorious weakness for expensive liquor and a lack of impulse control. I want your team to monitor the restricted wine cellar constantly. If he attempts to access the vintage collection, you are to allow him inside. Do not stop him from taking anything. Just make sure the hidden cameras capture his face clearly as he steals bottles of wine that cost more than his annual salary. I want evidence of his theft. David pulled up a digital inventory log on his secondary monitor. We have bottles in that cellar valued at over $10,000 each, he noted. Are you absolutely certain you want to leave them unguarded? I smiled a cold, calculating smile in the dark room. They are not unguarded, David. They are bait. I want my family to feel completely untouchable this weekend. I want them to believe they can treat this estate like their own personal playground. Your job is to meticulously document every piece of property damage they cause. When my sister shatters a crystal vase or ruins a Persian rug because of her reckless behavior, your team will log the exact time and the precise financial value of the destroyed item. When my mother demands the staff open rare champagne and spills it on the antique velvet sofas, I want a damage report generated immediately. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching the tactical teams silently infiltrating the dark hallways to install hidden lenses. Every stolen bottle of wine, every broken antique, and every damaged piece of furniture will be compiled into a master invoice, I instructed. I want the damage report finalized and printed on heavy corporate cardstock by Saturday morning. You will list the exact replacement cost for every item my family destroys. They think they are getting a luxury venue for free by forcing me to work as a slave. They have no idea they are racking up a massive bill that will bury them. David gave a firm nod, locking the new surveillance protocols into the system. The trap is completely set, he confirmed. The cameras will be fully operational within the hour. We will build an airtight portfolio of their destruction. You will have the master invoice in your hands before the wedding march plays. I thanked him quietly and turned away from the glowing wall of monitors. The meticulous documentation would serve as the final perfect nail in their financial coffin. I slipped back out through the heavy steel door, navigating the hidden passages with silent purpose. I returned to my cramped servant quarters and picked up the scratchy maid uniform. Tomorrow they would continue to treat me like dirt, but I would smile knowing every single move they made was being recorded for their spectacular downfall. Friday night arrived with a suffocating tension that blanketed the entire property. The rehearsal dinner had concluded in a disastrous display of my family desperately trying to prove their fabricated wealth. I was back inside the heavily encrypted security control room, watching the digital feeds illuminate the dark space. David had stepped out to coordinate the perimeter patrol, leaving me entirely alone with the glowing monitors. I watched my father on camera 3 stumbling through the west corridor, clutching a stolen bottle of rare scotch. I watched my mother snapping her fingers at a caterer in the main hall. Everything was proceeding exactly according to my calculated plan. Then the heavy oak door behind me clicked open. This was completely impossible. The biometric lock required executive clearance, and David was the only other person authorized for entry. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, preparing to confront a major security breach. Standing in the doorway, perfectly composed and draped in an elegant silk evening gown, was Josephine Davenport. She stepped into the glow of the surveillance monitors and the heavy door sealed shut behind her. She did not look surprised to see me wearing my dark tactical clothing instead of the scratchy maid uniform. She simply crossed her arms and studied the massive wall of screens displaying every corner of my estate. It takes a remarkably sophisticated encryption key to bypass a biometric lock, Josephine stated, her voice calm and smooth as velvet. But my corporate security team has always enjoyed a good challenge. She turned her sharp dark eyes away from the monitors and locked them directly onto me. Good evening, Naomi, Josephine said, offering a small knowing smile. Or should I address you by your proper title? Chief Executive Officer of Apex Elite Management. I let out a slow, measured breath. The charade between us was finally over. I stood up straight, meeting the gaze of the billionaire matriarch as an absolute equal. Naomi is perfectly fine, Josephine, I replied, keeping my tone professional and steady. Though I must admit, I am incredibly curious why you decided to hack into my private security mainframe on the eve of your son's wedding. Josephine walked gracefully toward the center console, pulling up a sleek leather chair and taking a seat. She gestured for me to sit across from her. Two highly intelligent, powerful women sitting in the dark, surrounded by surveillance feeds, preparing to lay their cards entirely on the table. I despise being lied to. Josephine began, her voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling register. I despise tacky, desperate people who attempt to climb into my family using deceit and manipulation. Your parents and your sister are quite possibly the most abhorrent individuals I have ever had the profound displeasure of meeting. I nodded slowly in complete agreement. They are highly toxic, I confirmed, which is exactly why I cut them out of my real life years ago. I figured as much, Josephine replied, smoothing a crease in her silk gown. When Patricia proudly announced you were a house cleaner at the engagement dinner, I almost exposed you right then. But I know you, Naomi. I know your business acumen. I know how ruthlessly you protect your assets. If you were playing along with their pathetic delusion, it meant you were setting a trap. I wanted to see exactly how deep the rabbit hole went before I intervened. Josephine pointed a manicured finger at the monitor, showing Stella screaming at a valet driver in the courtyard. My son Trey is a good man, Josephine continued, her expression softening just a fraction. He is brilliant in boardrooms, but he has a terrible blind spot when it comes to matters of the heart. He truly believed Stella was a sweet philanthropic girl from a respectable family. But the facade is rapidly crumbling. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the console. What has Trey noticed? Everything, Josephine stated flatly. Trey is observant. He noticed the aggressive way Stella treats the service staff. He noticed the completely erratic spending habits. Last week, he found a massive discrepancy in the wedding budget. Stella claimed her father was paying for this entire magnificent estate out of pocket. But Trey knows wealth, Naomi. He knows Richard does not possess the capital to rent a property of this magnitude. Trey asked me to run a quiet background check on your family. And what did your security team find? I asked, already knowing the answer. They found mountains of credit card debt. Josephine scoffed, shaking her head in disgust. They found a second mortgage on a suburban home. They found zero evidence of the trusts and offshore accounts your father has been bragging about all weekend. But more importantly, my team discovered that this estate is fully owned by Apex Elite Management. The pieces click together perfectly. You own this property. You are letting them hang themselves. I am doing much more than that. I corrected her, my voice turning ice cold. I am preparing to completely annihilate them. Josephine leaned back in her chair, a look of deep respect flashing across her features. I want to help you, she declared firmly. Trey is planning to call off the wedding. He is pacing in his suite right now, trying to figure out how to confront her without causing a public scandal. But I told him to wait. I told him we need to handle this with absolute precision. I refuse to let that greedy little gold digger walk away playing the victim. She will not be walking away at all today, I promised. I reached into my secure digital vault and pulled up the encrypted file on the main console monitor. If Trey wants a reason to cancel the wedding, I have the ultimate justification right here. I opened the document and turned the large screen toward her. Josephine Davenport leaned in very close and read the horrific financial truth displayed in stark black text. Josephine scanned the glowing screen. Her sharp eyes darted across the digital bank statement, reading every single detail of the fraudulent transaction. I watched her perfectly sculpted features harden as the reality of the $200,000 personal loan registered in her brilliant mind. She read my full legal name printed at the top of the document. She saw my highly confidential Social Security number listed right below it. Then she traced the routing numbers, recognizing immediately that the funds had been aggressively deposited into an account bearing Stella's signature. The silence in the security control room grew incredibly heavy. Josephine slowly leaned back in the sleek leather chair and let out a long, measured breath. She folded her manicured hands in her lap, staring at the monitor with absolute, undisguised disgust. Your own sister stole your identity, Josephine stated, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. She committed massive federal financial fraud just to pay for this ridiculous wedding charade. She saddled you with $250,000 in debt so she could buy imported orchids and pretend she belongs in our social circle. I nodded once, keeping my expression completely devoid of emotion. She forged my signature and leveraged my pristine credit score. I confirmed. My corporate attorneys have already prepared an airtight identity theft case. The civil lawsuits and the federal criminal referrals are fully drafted and waiting for my command. Josephine turned her gaze away from the monitor and looked directly into my eyes. The disgust on her face vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a look of profound, genuine admiration. A lesser woman would have marched into the rehearsal dinner tonight and screamed this truth from the rooftops, Josephine noted. A weaker person would have called the local police the second they found this bank statement. But you did not do that, Naomi. You secured the evidence, you mobilized your legal team. You put on a scratchy gray uniform and scrubbed floors just to lull them into a false sense of absolute security. The level of calculated restraint you possess is absolutely terrifying. I respect it immensely. I smiled a very cold and very dangerous smile. If I confronted Stella behind closed doors, she would have cried and manipulated the situation, I explained. She would have run directly to Trey, playing the innocent victim. I needed her to fall from a height so massive that she could never possibly recover. I needed her to be standing at the altar surrounded by everything she ever wanted when the hammer finally dropped. Josephine leaned forward, a fierce, predatory light sparking in her dark eyes. "We are going to give her exactly what she deserves," Josephine declared. "Trey already wants to cancel this wedding because of her erratic behavior, but doing it quietly in a hotel suite is far too merciful for a criminal of this magnitude. If she wants a spectacular high society event, we will absolutely give her one. We will make it the most unforgettable ceremony this estate has ever hosted." I pulled up the digital schedule for the wedding ceremony on the secondary monitor. The guests are scheduled to be seated in the grand hall by 2 in the afternoon. I told her the string quartet will begin playing exactly 15 minutes later. Stella insists on making a grand dramatic entrance down the main staircase. Josephine studied the timeline and nodded sharply. "I will personally guarantee that Trey is standing right there at the altar waiting for her," Josephine promised. "I will ensure that every single member of the Davenport extended family is seated directly in the front row. I have several influential friends attending tomorrow, including 2 federal judges and a prominent district attorney. I will make sure they all have a perfect, unobstructed view of the fireworks. My security director has locked down the entire perimeter," I added. "Nobody leaves this property until I give the explicit authorization. My legal team will file the criminal charges at exactly 1 in the afternoon. The local police department will dispatch units to the estate to execute the federal arrest warrant." Josephine stood up from the leather chair, smoothing the elegant silk of her evening gown. She looked like a general preparing for absolute warfare. "You have built a magnificent trap," Naomi Josephine said, extending her hand toward me. "I am incredibly honored to help you spring it." I stood up and shook the billionaire matriarch's hand, cementing our devastating alliance. We finalized a few more logistical details, coordinating our exact timing for the following afternoon. Josephine then turned and slipped quietly out of the security control room, navigating the hidden passages back to her luxury suite. I remained in the dark control room for a few minutes longer, watching the surveillance feeds. My parents were finally asleep in their guest wing, completely unaware of the massive legal avalanche hurtling toward them. Stella was asleep in the master suite, dreaming of her fake billionaire future. I logged out of the main console, securing the encrypted network, and stepping back into the hidden staff corridors. I walked silently through the narrow passages, returning to the cramped, windowless servant quarters my family had forced me to occupy. The small room felt suffocating, but I did not care. It was the last night I would ever have to endure their cruelty. I picked up the scratchy gray maid uniform from the thin mattress, folding it neatly and setting it aside. I would wear it one last time tomorrow morning, just to maintain the perfect illusion. I lay down on the uncomfortable cot, staring up at the dark ceiling. I reached over to my phone and set my alarm for 5 in the morning. My heart beat with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. There was no fear left in my body. There was no anxiety. There was only a profound, chilling sense of peace. The storm was finally coming, and I was holding all the lightning. My alarm buzzed sharply at exactly 5 in the morning, cutting through the heavy silence of the cramped servant quarters. I reached over and silenced my phone in a single fluid motion. The darkness of the room mirrored the quiet anticipation, pulsing through my veins. Today was the day I threw off the scratchy blanket and stood up ready to face the chaos my family was about to unleash. I pulled on the cheap gray maid uniform for the very last time. It felt different today. It no longer felt like a humiliating disguise. It felt like battle armor. I tied my hair back and stepped out into the bustling service corridors. I navigated the busy kitchen, avoiding the executive chefs, and walked toward the main guest wing. The air was thick with intense underlying panic. Stella had been awake since dawn, terrorizing my elite hospitality team. I found my sister pacing furiously in the center of the extravagant bridal suite. She was wearing a white silk robe and clutching a large crystal glass filled to the brim with expensive red wine, drinking heavy Merlot. Before noon was erratic, but Stella was operating on pure manic desperation. She was barking orders at a terrified seamstress who was trying to steam the train of her heavily beaded wedding gown. I stood quietly, near the doorway holding a silver tray, playing my role to absolute perfection. Stella spun around to yell at the seamstress again, but her foot caught on the edge of a gilded ottoman. She stumbled backward, flailing her arms wildly to catch her balance. The crystal goblet slipped from her grasp and shattered violently across the floor. A massive wave of dark red wine splashed onto a priceless antique Persian rug. I watched the dark crimson liquid soak into the delicate hand-woven silk fibers, permanently ruining the historical artifact. Stella froze, staring at the spreading red stain with wide, panicked eyes. Instead of apologizing, she immediately looked up and locked her furious gaze onto me. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Get over here right now!" She stomped her foot dangerously close to the shattered glass. "Look at this massive mess you caused by standing there distracting me. Go fetch the heavy-duty bleach and scrub this out immediately. I need this completely spotless before the real guests arrive and see this disaster. Move faster, you useless idiot." I kept my face entirely blank, completely ignoring her ridiculous accusation. I looked down at the ruined $40,000 rug. I mentally added the precise replacement cost to the final invoice. My security team was preparing. I gave a slow, submissive nod and turned around. I walked out of the bridal suite, moving down the grand marble hallway, carrying a plastic bucket filled with stain removers and scrubbing brushes. The estate was rapidly filling with high society guests. I walked briskly toward the hidden service doors. Before I could reach the safety of the corridor, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I was violently yanked backward, spinning around to face my mother. Patricia was wearing an outrageously garish mother of the bride dress, covered in reflective silver beads. Her face was flushed with frantic anxiety, and her grip on my arm was bruisingly tight. She dragged me roughly behind a massive marble pillar, pushing me aggressively against the cold stone wall to ensure none of the arriving guests could see us talking. The smell of her cheap perfume made me want to gag. "Listen to me very carefully," Patricia hissed. "The Davenport family is already mingling in the main courtyard. This is the most important day in the history of our family, and I will not let you ruin it." She tightened her painful grip on my arm, digging her sharp manicured nails directly into my skin. "If Trey's family sees you walking around in that disgusting maid uniform, they will think we are absolute trash. They will think we come from impoverished losers. You are an embarrassing, dirty secret that I have to hide. I want you to go directly down to the basement kitchen. You stay locked in that kitchen until the vows are completely over and every single guest has moved into the reception hall. Do you understand me? You do not show your face." I looked into my mother's eyes, seeing the pure, unfiltered disdain she held for her own flesh and blood. She truly believed I was a filthy peasant, ruining her grand entrance into high society. I looked at her with a dull expression. I gave her one final, slow, obedient nod. "Yes, Mother," I whispered, my voice sounding perfectly crushed. "I will stay in the kitchen." Patricia let out a harsh scoff of disgust and released my arm. "Good," she snapped, adjusting her silver dress. "See that you do." She turned on her heel and marched proudly down the marble hallway, rushing to greet a group of wealthy Davenport relatives with a sickeningly sweet fake smile. I stood perfectly still behind the marble pillar, watching her disappear around the corner. The second she was completely out of sight, the defeated posture instantly vanished from my body. I stood up perfectly straight, looked down at the plastic bucket filled with cheap stain removers hanging from my hand. I walked calmly over to a large industrial trash bin located just inside the service corridor. Without a single second of hesitation, I dropped the entire bucket into the garbage. The heavy plastic hit the bottom of the bin with a loud, satisfying thud. The charade was officially over. I turned my back on the kitchen and began walking purposefully toward the restricted upper levels of the estate. This massive property was my kingdom. The time for playing the weak, invisible servant was finished. My family was standing perfectly positioned in the direct blast zone. I would not miss it for the world. The countdown was on. I navigated the labyrinth of hidden executive corridors with absolute precision. My destination was the master owner's suite, located on the uppermost floor of the estate. This was the only room on the entire property that Stella had been strictly forbidden from entering. My estate management team had explicitly informed her that the suite was reserved for the corporate owner and was completely off-limits to wedding guests. Stella had thrown a massive tantrum about it earlier in the week, demanding access to the ultimate luxury space, but my security director had physically blocked the heavy double doors. She had no idea that the mysterious corporate owner denying her the room was the very same maid she had ordered to scrub her floors. I reached the massive mahogany doors and pressed my palm against the biometric scanner. The intricate locking mechanism engaged reading my unique biological signature. The heavy doors swung inward with a soft mechanical hiss, welcoming me into my private sanctuary. I stepped inside and locked the doors behind me, sealing out the chaotic noise of the wedding preparations happening on the lower levels. The suite was an absolute masterpiece of modern design, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the crashing ocean. I walked directly toward the center of the expansive room and stopped. I reached up and unbuttoned the scratchy gray maid uniform. I peeled the cheap abrasive fabric off my shoulders and let it drop completely to the hardwood floor. I kicked the hideous rubber shoes away. The heavy weight of the submissive servant persona fell away with the discarded clothing. I stepped into the massive glass-enclosed rainfall shower and turned the water temperature as high as I could stand. The steaming hot water washed away the smell of industrial bleach and the lingering stench of my mother's cheap perfume. I scrubbed my skin until it was flushed and glowing, entirely erasing the dirt and the humiliation of the past few days. I was washing away the scared, unloved daughter who had constantly sought validation from people incapable of giving it. I stepped out of the shower and wrapped myself in a plush heated towel. I walked over to the custom-built mahogany vanity where my executive assistant had securely arranged my personal belongings the night before. It was time to put on my armor. I sat down and began my transformation with meticulous, focused intent. I applied my makeup with ruthless precision, highlighting my cheekbones and applying a deep crimson lipstick that practically screamed authority. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless chignon that left my neck and shoulders completely bare. There was not a single strand out of place. Then I walked over to the custom velvet garment bag hanging in the center of the massive walk-in closet. I unzipped the bag, revealing a breathtaking custom-tailored black silk evening gown. It was an architectural marvel designed exclusively for me by a top European fashion house. The dark silk flowed like liquid obsidian, pooling elegantly around my feet. I slipped into the gown, feeling the incredibly expensive fabric glide smoothly over my skin. It fit my body with absolute perfection, featuring a sharp plunging neckline and a daring thigh-high slit that projected pure, unadulterated power. This was not a dress meant for blending into the background. It was a weapon forged from silk and shadows, designed to command total attention and paralyze anyone who dared to challenge me. I stepped into a pair of towering black stilettos, completing the imposing silhouette. I looked incredibly dangerous. But the transformation was not quite finished. I walked over to the heavy steel wall safe, hidden behind a framed abstract painting. I entered my secure passcode and turned the cold metal dial. Inside the dark velvet-lined compartment rested a stunning jewelry box. I pulled it out and snapped the lid open, revealing a blindingly brilliant $1 million diamond necklace. The massive, flawless stones caught the ambient light and threw sharp rainbows across the dark walls of the suite. I lifted the heavy necklace from its velvet bed and clasped it securely around my neck. The icy weight of the diamonds settled perfectly against my collarbone. I added the matching diamond drop earrings, letting them frame my face with sharp, sparkling elegance. I turned to face the floor-to-ceiling mirror and stared at the woman looking back at me. There was no trace of the obedient maid. There was no trace of the invisible, discarded sister. Standing in the mirror was the untouchable billionaire, chief executive officer of Apex Elite Management. I looked like a queen preparing to completely decimate her enemies. The armor was fully assembled, and the executioner was ready to step onto the battlefield. I raised my left wrist and tapped the screen of my smartwatch. The digital display illuminated, showing a secure message from my lead corporate attorney. The message contained 3 words: legal documents filed. The civil lawsuits and federal criminal referrals for identity theft had been processed by the court system. A second notification popped up on the screen from David, my head of security. He confirmed that the local police department had been quietly notified, and unmarked patrol cars were currently staging just outside the main estate gates. The federal arrest warrants were active and ready to be served. The trap was completely locked and loaded. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air of my private suite. The string quartet had started playing the opening notes of the bridal march downstairs, indicating that the massive audience was fully seated and waiting for the ceremony to begin. The timing was absolutely perfect. I turned my back on the mirror and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I gripped the polished brass handles, pulled them open, and stepped confidently out into the corridor, ready to crash the ceremony. The grand staircase sweeping down to the main level felt completely different under the sharp click of my stilettos. The string quartet, positioned perfectly in the alcove of the massive ballroom, transitioned smoothly into the traditional wedding march. The rich, vibrant notes echoed through the cavernous space, signaling to the hundreds of seated guests that the highly anticipated bride was finally making her arrival. I stood in the shadowed antechamber just behind the towering solid oak double doors of the grand hall. 2 of my elite security guards stood at attention on either side of the entrance. I gave them a single sharp nod. They grasped the heavy brass handles and pulled the massive doors open simultaneously with a dramatic synchronized pull. Brilliant golden light poured from the ballroom into the antechamber, washing completely over my dark silk gown and illuminating the $1 million diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold and stepping directly onto the pristine white aisle runner that had been rolled out specifically for my sister. The music swelled as I began my descent down the center of the room. The collective reaction was instantaneous and electric. Over 300 guests, all dressed in their absolute finest designer evening wear, turned their heads in perfect unison, expecting to see Stella draped in imported lace and tulle. Instead, they saw me. A collective sharp gasp ripped through the massive crystal ballroom, followed immediately by a sudden heavy silence that completely swallowed the music. The string quartet faltered, and the cellist actually stopped playing altogether, leaving a strange, discordant echo hanging in the air. My staggering elegance and aggressive millionaire aura instantly dominated the entire room. I did not walk down the aisle like a demure, blushing bride. I marched down the white runner like a conquering general, surveying a newly captured territory. The heavy black silk of my custom gown flowed around my legs like liquid shadows, while the flawless diamonds around my neck threw blinding shards of light across the stunned faces of the elite crowd. Guests who had never seen me before whispered frantically to one another, trying to figure out who this incredibly wealthy, mysterious woman was and why she was hijacking a high society wedding. As I moved further down the aisle, I locked my eyes directly on the altar. Trey Davenport stood under the massive archway of imported white roses, looking absolutely bewildered. His handsome face was a canvas of pure confusion. He glanced past me, looking toward the doors, to see if his bride was following close behind, but the antechamber remained completely empty. Trey shifted uncomfortably in his tailored tuxedo, entirely unsure of how to handle this bizarre, unprecedented interruption. He looked from me to the front row, desperately seeking an explanation. Sitting directly in the center of the very first row was Josephine Davenport. Unlike the rest of the terrified, confused guests, Josephine was perfectly relaxed. She sat elegantly in her chair, her posture immaculate, and her sharp, dark eyes shining with intense, calculated satisfaction. When my gaze met hers, she did not show a single ounce of surprise. Instead, she offered me a slow, deep, knowing smile. It was the smile of a billionaire matriarch watching a perfectly orchestrated execution unfold exactly as planned. She subtly raised her chin, acknowledging my power and validating the spectacular trap we had sprung together. The silence in the grand hall was violently shattered by a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek. The sound came directly from the left side of the front row, where the bride's family was seated. My mother Patricia had leaped completely out of her chair. Her face turned an alarming shade of chalk white as she stared at the daughter she had relegated to the basement kitchen just hours prior. Her hands shook so violently that the expensive crystal champagne flute she was holding slipped right through her fingers. The glass hit the marble floor and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, sending expensive champagne splashing across the polished stone and onto the hem of her overly sequined dress. She did not even flinch at the sound of the breaking crystal. Patricia could only point a trembling manicured finger at my face, her mouth opening and closing without producing any actual words. The absolute shock of seeing the invisible discarded maid transformed into a terrifying vision of extreme wealth and power had short-circuited her entire brain. She stumbled backward, knocking her chair completely over in her frantic attempt to distance herself from the reality standing right in front of her. While my mother collapsed into a state of paralyzed horror, my father Richard reacted with pure, unadulterated, and absolute explosive rage. The veins in his neck bulged heavily against the tight collar of his rented tuxedo. His face turned a dangerous shade of deep, violent purple as he realized his carefully constructed facade of high society wealth was being systematically destroyed in front of the Davenport family. He did not care about the hundreds of wealthy guests watching his every move. I did not care about the highly inappropriate setting. He shoved his way past the overturned velvet chair and stormed directly down the white aisle toward me. His heavy footsteps pounded loudly against the floorboards, matching the furious beating of my own racing heart. I stopped walking and planted my stilettos firmly onto the white runner, standing my ground as he aggressively closed the remaining distance between us. I was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides, entirely prepared to physically grab my arm and drag me out of the grand ballroom by brute force. He truly believed he still held the power to command me, to dominate me, and to banish me back to the cold, dark shadows where he thought I belonged. He stopped mere inches from my face, his eyes burning with intense malice, as the entire silent ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the absolute worst confrontation. Section 17, exactly 1,000 words. "What are you doing here?" Richard hissed, his voice vibrating with absolute venom. "You ungrateful little wretch, I told you to stay in the kitchen." He raised his hand as if he was actually going to grab my arm and drag me bodily out of the room. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stared at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. When he realized I was not going to cower or obey his commands, his frustration boiled over into a full-blown public meltdown. He turned his attention away from me and looked wildly around the massive crystal ballroom. He spotted the estate security personnel stationed near the entrances and exits. These guards were highly trained professionals, wearing crisp dark suits and discreet earpieces, looking incredibly intimidating. Richard violently waved his arms in the air, signaling desperately to the heavy security team. "Grab this crazy woman," he bellowed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings and silencing any remaining whispers among the elite guests. "Grab this crazy woman and throw her out into the street right now. She is a trespasser and she is trying to ruin my daughter's wedding. Remove her immediately." The guests gasped again, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some of the Davenport relatives exchanged alarmed glances, wondering why the father of the bride was screaming at a woman draped in millions of dollars worth of diamonds. Richard stood tall, crossing his arms over his chest, panting slightly from the exertion of his outburst. He waited for the security guards to rush forward and execute his aggressive commands. I truly expected them to tackle me to the marble floor and drag me out the service doors like a common criminal. Instead, the grand mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom opened wide. David, my head of security, stepped into the room. He was an imposing figure, a towering former military operative who commanded absolute authority. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps down the white aisle runner, moving directly toward where Richard and I stood locked in our standoff. 4 other elite security guards fell into step perfectly behind him, forming a tight, impenetrable tactical formation. Richard smirked, looking back at me with a triumphant glare. "You are finished, Naomi," he sneered, assuming the approaching security detail was coming to forcefully remove me. "You pushed me too far, and now you are going to pay the ultimate price today." David reached our position. Richard took a step back, gesturing broadly toward me, as if presenting a captured prisoner. "Take her away," Richard ordered, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. David did not even blink. He did not acknowledge Richard's presence or his frantic, aggressive commands. He completely ignored my father, walking straight past him, as if he were nothing more than an invisible piece of furniture. The sharp dismissal caused Richard to falter, his extended arm dropping awkwardly to his side. David stopped directly in front of me. He snapped his heels together, standing at rigid attention. The entire ballroom watched in absolute stunned silence as this massive, intimidating security director performed an action that completely shattered their reality. David bowed perfectly, at a 90-degree angle, bending his waist in a display of profound, ultimate respect. "Madam Chairman," David said, his deep, commanding voice carrying easily across the dead silent room. "The perimeter is secured as you requested. Shall we detain these guests?" The sheer magnitude of those 3 simple sentences struck the room like a physical shockwave. The words hung heavily in the air, impossible to misinterpret. "Madam Chairman, the perimeter is secured. Shall we detain these guests?" He was actively asking me for permission to arrest my own family right here. Richard froze completely. His body went entirely rigid, as if someone had just injected wet cement directly into his veins. The smug, triumphant grin that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago vanished, utterly, completely wiped away by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at David, then he looked at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. The gears in his head were aggressively grinding, trying desperately to process how the worthless daughter he had relegated to the basement was suddenly being addressed as the supreme commander of this entire luxury fortress. Behind him, Patricia let out a strangled, horrific gasp. She stumbled backward, her high heels catching on the hem of her cheap sequined dress. She fell heavily into an empty chair, clutching her chest as she struggled to pull oxygen into her panic-stricken lungs. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking at the heavily armed guards who had just pledged their absolute loyalty to the woman she had mercilessly abused for 33 years. The realization that I was the actual owner of the multi-million-dollar estate they had hijacked was crashing down on her, crushing her delusional superiority into fine dust. But the most spectacular reaction came from the side entrance. Stella had been waiting in the wings, preparing for her grand bridal entrance. She stood in the arched doorway wearing her extravagant white gown, completely paralyzed by the scene unfolding at the altar. She had heard every single word David said. She saw the elite security force bowing to her older sister. She saw the $1 million diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. The flawless fantasy world she had built using stolen money and vicious lies instantly evaporated. Stella's hands began to shake violently. Her grip on her massive cascading bouquet of rare imported white orchids loosened. The heavy floral arrangement slipped right through her trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a soft, devastating thud. The pristine white petals scattered wildly across the stone, breaking apart, just like her fake billionaire future. The reality of the situation began to crush them all. I stood there holding all the power. The silence in the room was brittle, ready to shatter completely under the immense weight of the truth. Josephine Davenport decided it was the perfect time to deliver the final crushing blow. She stood up from her seat, moving with the deliberate lethal grace of an apex predator. She turned to face the hundreds of confused elite guests gathered in the grand hall. Her commanding voice echoed effortlessly across the massive crystal ballroom, slicing through the tension like a finely sharpened blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," Josephine announced, her tone radiating absolute authority. "It appears there has been a severe and rather pathetic misunderstanding orchestrated by the bride and her incredibly deceitful family. Allow me to clear the air and introduce our unexpected but highly esteemed guest properly." She extended a graceful manicured hand directly toward me. "Please allow me to introduce Naomi, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Elite Management. She is our largest corporate partner, the sole manager of the Davenport Global Property Portfolio, and most importantly, the absolute legal owner of this entire magnificent estate." The collective gasp from the audience was louder this time. Murmurs of shock rippled through the rows of gilded chairs. The elite guests whispered frantically, pointing at my parents, who were shrinking under the harsh burning spotlight of public humiliation. The illusion my family had so desperately manufactured was entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. Patricia let out a strangled whimper, hiding her face behind her trembling hands, unable to meet the piercing stares of the high society individuals she had tried so desperately to impress. Richard looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath his expensive rented shoes. The realization that they had been screaming at, threatening, and attempting to enslave a billionaire CEO on her own property finally sank deep into his thick skull. He had threatened a woman who held the power to buy and sell his entire corporate existence a dozen times over. I did not give him a single second to recover or formulate a pathetic apology. I stepped past David and walked directly up to my father. I stood so close to him that I could see the sweat beading on his forehead and smell the sour stench of raw fear radiating from his skin. My voice dripped with pure, unforgiving ice when I finally spoke to him. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," I said, holding out my open palm. "Hand it over, Richard." I did not call him Dad. He had forfeited that title the moment he decided to weaponize the memory of my dead grandmother. He hesitated, his eyes darting frantically toward the armed security guard standing at rigid attention just a few feet away. He knew that if he resisted or attempted to cause a scene, David would have him physically tackled to the marble floor and dragged out in handcuffs. The fight completely drained out of his body, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His hands shook violently as he reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out the faded velvet box, clutching it as if it were the last remaining piece of his shattered dignity. He did not say a word. He could not even look me in the eyes. He simply placed the velvet box into my outstretched hand, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the pristine white aisle runner. I snapped the box open, verifying the antique sapphire and diamond brooch was safely resting on the yellowed satin. The beautiful heirlooms sparkled brilliantly under the grand chandeliers, finally safe from his vile extortion tactics. I snapped the lid shut and slipped the box securely into a hidden pocket of my dark silk gown. "That is one debt settled," I stated coldly. "But we are far from finished." I reached into another concealed pocket and pulled out a thick envelope made of heavy premium corporate cardstock. I had instructed my security team to compile the damage report with ruthless efficiency, and they had delivered perfectly. The document inside was incredibly detailed, listing every single violation, every stolen item, and every piece of property destruction my family had committed since arriving at the grand estate. I pulled the crisp, printed invoice from the envelope and held it up right in front of Richard's sweaty face. "You and your ridiculous family thought you could treat my property like a personal playground," I told him, ensuring my voice carried clearly enough for the front rows to hear. "You thought you were entitled to abuse my staff, steal my vintage wine, and destroy historical artifacts because you believed you were untouchable guests. You believed you were royalty walking among peasants." I slapped the heavy invoice directly against his chest, forcing him to instinctively grab the paper before it fell to the floor. "That is a fully itemized bill for $50,000, I announced sharply. "It covers the exact replacement cost of the $40,000 Persian rug your reckless daughter ruined this morning. It covers the precise retail value of the rare scotch you stole from my restricted wine cellar last night." It covers the crystal vases Patricia shattered, and the antique velvet chairs she stained with cheap champagne. Every single violation has been captured on high-definition hidden cameras and fully documented by my legal team. The invoice is payable immediately. If the funds are not wired into my corporate account by Monday morning, my attorneys will file a civil lawsuit and place a massive lien on your pathetic suburban home. Richard stared down at the $50,000 invoice, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He was already drowning in the debt he had secretly accumulated to fund Stella's lavish lifestyle. This massive bill was the final crushing weight that would break his financial back entirely. He looked at Patricia, who was now openly sobbing heavily into her shaking hands, completely humiliated. Trey Davenport had stood silently at the altar, watching the entire spectacular collapse of my greedy family unfold right before his eyes. He had watched my father shrink into a terrified hollow shell of a man, and witnessed my mother crying violently over a $50,000 damage invoice. But most importantly, he had watched Stella. He had seen the way her fake innocent bride persona instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces when she realized her lies were completely exposed. Trey stepped slowly down from the elevated marble altar. He bypassed the terrified wedding officiant who was clutching his ceremonial binder like a useless protective shield. Trey walked with deliberate heavy steps, moving directly toward the archway where Stella stood frozen in her extravagant white gown. He looked down at the crushed imported orchids scattered across the floor, and then he looked up at the woman he was supposed to marry. There was no love left in his eyes. There was no confusion or hesitation. There was only absolute unadulterated disgust. He looked at Stella as if she were a venomous snake that had somehow slithered into his pristine, organized life. He reached out and smoothly took the microphone directly from the trembling hand of the officiant. The soft static feedback of the microphone echoed briefly through the massive grand hall, drawing the undivided attention of every single guest in the room. Trey turned to face the audience, his posture rigid and his jaw tightly clenched. He did not yell or lose his composure. He spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who had just dodged a massive, lethal bullet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trey announced, his deep voice projecting clearly through the high-quality sound system. "I want to apologize to all of you for wasting your valuable time today. There will be no wedding ceremony." A collective gasp rippled through the rows of seated guests, but Trey completely ignored the rising noise. He turned his body and pointed directly at Stella. For the last year, Trey continued looking straight into her terrified eyes. "I believed I was marrying a kind, generous woman who shared my core values. I believed you were heavily involved in charity work. I believed you were a decent, honest human being. But you are nothing more than a highly manipulative, deeply calculating fraud." My mother Josephine came to my suite just hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She showed me a highly encrypted digital file containing a certified bank statement. She showed me exactly how you managed to afford this extravagant lifestyle in this multi-million-dollar venue. You did not use your parents' non-existent wealth. You did not use your own hard-earned savings. You stole from your own family. Trey took a firm step closer to Stella, forcing her to shrink back against the heavy wooden doorframe. "You stole your own sister's social security number," Trey declared, the absolute severity of the crime ringing loudly through the ballroom. "You forged her signature and illegally secured a $200,000 personal loan just to pay for this ridiculous party. You saddled the sister you treat like absolute garbage with $250,000 in debt so you could pretend you belong in my world. This wedding is completely over." The sheer brutality of the public exposure hit Stella like a physical freight train. The massive secret she had so desperately tried to hide was now common knowledge among hundreds of the most influential people in the entire country. Her legs completely gave out beneath the heavy, suffocating layers of imported silk and tulle. Stella collapsed hard onto her knees, hitting the polished marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud. She threw her shaking hands over her face and began sobbing hysterically. Her cries echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, a pathetic, desperate sound that elicited absolutely zero sympathy from anyone in the room. "Trey, please," she wailed, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the hem of his tailored suit trousers. "Please, you have to listen to me. I only did it because I love you so incredibly much. I wanted to give you the beautiful, flawless wedding you deserved. I was going to figure out a way to pay the money back, I swear. I can fix this terrible mistake. Just do not leave me here. Trey looked down at her grasping hands with an expression of pure, unfiltered revulsion. He physically stepped backward, forcefully ripping the expensive fabric of his trousers out of her desperate, frantic grip. You do not love me, Stella Trey said, his voice dripping with icy contempt. You love my bank account and you love my family name. You are a criminal. Do not ever try to contact me again. Trey handed the microphone to the frozen officiant and turned his back on the weeping bride. He walked steadily toward his mother standing in the front row. Josephine Davenport did not say a word. She did not need to. She offered her son a firm, approving nod, acknowledging his refusal to be manipulated by a con artist. Josephine raised her chin, giving a sharp signal to the rest of the Davenport family. The reaction was immediate and flawlessly synchronized. Every member of the Davenport extended family, seated in the front rows, stood up in perfect unison. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and powerful corporate partners rose from their gilded chairs, moving with quiet, dignified power. They looked at Stella sobbing on the floor. They looked at Patricia weeping in her chair. They looked at Richard clutching the damage invoice. The Davenports did not hurl any insults or scream. They simply turned their backs on my shattered family and began walking toward the main exit with absolute chilling disdain. The sound of their footsteps marching out sounded like a steady drumbeat of total devastation. My greedy family wanted to be accepted by these people, and now they were discarded like worthless trash. Section 20, exactly 1,000 words. As the oak doors closed behind the departing Davenport family, a new sound pierced the silence of the grand ballroom. The distinct wail of approaching police sirens cut through the coastal air, growing rapidly louder as multiple patrol cars sped up the cobblestone driveway. Red and blue emergency lights flashed brilliantly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the shocked faces of the remaining guests in harsh color. The front doors swung open, and two uniformed police officers strode purposefully into the grand hall. They bypassed the whispering crowds marching directly toward the altar where Stella remained crumpled on the marble floor. Stella Adams, one of the officers, announced, his stern voice projecting easily across the room. We hold a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of identity theft, wire fraud, and financial exploitation. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back. Stella let out a guttural scream of pure terror. She scrambled backward, her white wedding gown tangling around her legs, making her look like a trapped ghost. She looked wildly toward our parents, but they were completely paralyzed by the sudden devastating reality of federal law enforcement invading their fake high society sanctuary. The officers did not hesitate. They grabbed Stella's arms firmly, hauling her forcefully to her feet and expertly securing heavy metal handcuffs around her wrists, right over the delicate imported lace of her bridal sleeves. The metallic click of the cuffs locking into place completely sealed her dark fate. Patricia suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She lunged forward, tripping over the hem of her ruined dress, throwing herself desperately at my feet. Naomi, please, Patricia wailed, grabbing the black silk of my custom gown. Please, you have to stop this right now. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. You cannot send your own sister to federal prison. We are family, Naomi. You have to drop these charges for our sake. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman clutching my dress. I reached down and firmly pried her desperate fingers off my immaculate silk gown, stepping back to create a physical barrier between us. I did not raise my voice to make my words cut straight through her delusional heart. Family does not extort their own children, I stated, my voice radiating freezing authority. Family does not hold a dead grandmother's precious heirloom hostage just to force a daughter into unpaid labor. Family does not steal a social security number and commit massive federal financial fraud just to throw a glamorous party. You stood by and cheered while she actively tried to destroy my entire future. You are not my family, Patricia. You are just greedy, toxic parasites who finally picked the wrong host to feed on. I turned my gaze to Richard, who was clutching the $50,000 damage invoice, looking entirely broken and utterly defeated. The police officers began dragging a hysterically sobbing Stella down the aisle runner, marching her right past the horrified remaining guests. She screamed my name, begging me to save her, but I stood perfectly still, watching her face the exact consequences she had ruthlessly earned. Her cries echoed until the heavy wooden doors finally slammed shut, cutting off her voice completely. "David," I called out, keeping my eyes locked on my trembling parents. The head of security stepped immediately to my side, awaiting my final directive. "Escort Richard and Patricia off my property immediately," I ordered, gesturing toward the service exit. "Ensure they take nothing with them except the clothes on their backs. If they ever set foot near this estate again, you will have them arrested for criminal trespassing. I want them removed before I take another breath." David nodded, gesturing for his security team to move in. The armed guards flanked my parents, gripping their arms with brutal efficiency. Patricia sobbed loudly, burying her face in her hands, as she was forcefully marched toward the hidden service corridors. Richard stumbled along beside her, looking completely empty, stripped of his arrogant pride and fake wealth. They were thrown out the back door, exactly where they had tried to banish me just hours ago. They were left to walk home in complete, absolute disgrace. I walked slowly away from the chaotic ballroom, leaving my staff to clear the shattered glass and ruined flowers. I navigated the quiet upper corridors and stepped out onto the sprawling private balcony of the master owner's suite. Cool ocean breeze washed over my face, carrying the salty scent of the sea. I looked down at the massive cobblestone driveway, watching the flashing police lights disappear into the distance, carrying my sister away to a concrete cell. I watched my parents trudging down the long dark road on foot, entirely alone and completely ruined by their own malicious greed. The absolute silence of the magnificent estate felt like a warm, comforting embrace after years of enduring their endless noise. Sometimes the absolute hardest thing you will ever do is look at the people who share your blood and realize they are actively poisoning your soul. Society tells us we must forgive and endure endless abuse simply because it comes from relatives. But I am here to tell you that cutting off toxic family members is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound, necessary self-preservation. You owe absolutely nothing to people who only value you for what they can extract from your misery. When you finally stop allowing them to drain your light, you create the space to build an empire entirely your own. Your peace is worth protecting at any cost. Have you ever had to draw a ruthless boundary to protect yourself from toxic family members? Share your own personal story in the comment section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about claiming your power and demanding absolute justice. Until next time, please stay strong and never ever apologize for protecting your own peace. Take a bold step today to evaluate the boundaries in your own life and find the courage to fiercely protect your peace against anyone who tries to diminish your worth.